Ons is geskakel op GROOTplaas. Ons gas saam met ons vanoggend Crossey en hy is 'n wildlewe-endokrinoloog by die Universiteit van Pretoria. Bruce, good morning and welcome on GROOTplaas.
Morning, Duppy. It's great to be here with you. Thank you so much for having me.
So let's start off a very interesting article that you guys sent out about the research that you did, which pretty much summarizes that most of the tourists coming to South Africa aren't actually coming for the big five anymore.
Yeah, it's really exciting to see what we sort of challenge a lot of the assumptions that we make when we're looking at tourism in South Africa and in Southern Africa. We really tend to focus on the charismatic megafauna, your big five, people coming out to see the elephants, the rhinos, the big and hairies, as everyone likes to call them. And what we're actually finding in our study group was that, particularly amongst South Africans that have got a bit of experience and have spent a bit of time in game reserves, they are triggering more emotionally for your one-off sightings, your novel sightings. Birding came across as a big indicator. And then context matters. So how you view these animals really has a big impact on the emotional response people are having whilst viewing wildlife. And it's very exciting to be using a new methodology to be able to kind of shed light on this.
So would you say that local tourists have been desensitized to the big five and all of the wildlife we have access to, and they're actually looking for different opportunities, different sightings?
I think there's definitely potential for that. At the end of the day, I think it also comes down to a lot of the other factors that are involved in wildlife viewing. It's definitely more than just seeing the animals. So sometimes those big five sightings, we conducted this study in Pilanesberg National Park where you have quite a lot of elephants, you have quite a lot of rhino, thankfully, and you do see those species quite often. So what we found with the emotional responses in terms of the peaks and the spikes that people had when viewing those species was if the elephant or the big five were doing something quite interesting, then we obviously got a far bigger peak. But what was really fascinating was across the board, what we tend to find is that birding consistently provided these higher levels of emotional or psychophysiological arousal. So it's those one-off sightings and those novel sightings, perhaps seeing something new that is definitely driving that emotional response amongst the more experienced guests coming into the reserves. At the same time, of course, you do get those spikes for the big five, the big and hairies, but you do sometimes need to see a little bit more in terms of context when viewing those species.
I think for us to understand this study a little bit better, we need to understand how you actually conducted the study. So how many people were used in the study? What were you measuring? And over what type of period was this done?
Yes, sure. So this was basically a pilot study to use a new methodology that has been established in laboratories overseas and has been slowly rolled out into more ambulatory settings where people have been looking at how certain moments throughout the day matter emotionally to individuals. So what we did was we had 4 monitors, the electrodermal activity monitors, which literally measure the differences in electric potential on your skin. So the monitor goes right on your hand. You'll have 2 electrodes that come across here, and we run a slight electrical current across there. And because you have a lot of eccrine glands on your skin, we can pick up very slight changes in sweat or small secretions in sweat on your skin. So, for example, if you're on an interview and you start getting nervous, you'll notice that your palms start getting sweaty, and that's sort of the major response that you'd be measuring. So it's a measurement of the sympathetic nervous system, which is then tied back to emotion. And what we did was we placed those monitors on 12 South Africans because we wanted to see individuals who weren't necessarily international tourists that wouldn't trigger or have an emotional response for absolutely everything that they saw perhaps on the first time on a trip, and to try and standardize that a bit. And we took those individuals on game drives in Pilanesberg National Park and had continuous monitoring of their emotional state using this electrodermal activity as a proxy of that to see what exactly triggered them. Was it different sightings? Was it engaging in particular activities while they were out there? How much of an impact did lunch have on these kind of things? And was there perhaps a peak in the emotional state, the emotional arousal after people have been fed compared to when they are maybe been in the car for a little while and are starting to nod off? So we looked at all of those different factors, and because we have that instantaneous monitoring, you actually get a little, as the principal investigator, you actually get a little message sent to your phone when there is a trigger on one of the monitors. So what we would do is set the monitor to say, send my phone a trigger if the electrodermal activity of one of our participants spiked 15% higher than it was in the previous minute. So while I was recording everything that we saw in the reserve, I could make special note of moments that triggered that emotional response with that little prompt that was sent to my phone. So we have the monitoring in real time, we have the sightings that we had, and even though we had a very small sample size of 12 people, we did find that 10 out of the 12 individuals had a significantly higher electrodermal activity when viewing wildlife compared to not viewing wildlife. So just being in the presence of wildlife in those moments was something that triggered that electrodermal activity or that psychophysiological response. Just being in the reserve actually triggered that similar response. So for the duration of spending time in nature, we found that psychological arousal was increased. And this was because we measured the electrodermal activity from the moment we left Pretoria all the way through to the reserve, throughout the day at the reserve, and then all the way back. And we found that period during game drives in the reserve was heightened, actually, regardless of whether or not we were seeing wildlife.
Bruce, we're going to be back with you in a second. We're just going to take a quick ad break. Bruce Crossey, hy's 'n wildlewe-endokrinoloog by die Universiteit van Pretoria om te gesels oor 'n baie interessante studie wat hulle gedoen het by wildlewe-toerisme in Pilanesberg. Ons is terug net hierna. Is ingeskakel op GROOTplaas. Ons gas saam met ons vandag, Bruce Crossey. Hy's 'n wildlewe-endokrinoloog by die Universiteit van Pretoria. So, Bruce, we spoke about the study that you guys conducted, how this was conducted. But do you think this kind of shift in tourism could influence how we manage ecotourism and planning, especially when it comes to farms and reserves in South Africa?
Yes, definitely. I think what we can start to see from this is that there is a bit of a shift, or there should be a bit of a shift in our thinking from focusing on purely the big five and these megafauna, which are really confined to a smaller number of reserves than what we have here in South Africa. Obviously, we know that conservation in South Africa and the tourism industry are spread across the vast array and not really just concentrated in these national parks. So what we can see is that there's definitely tourism opportunities that are being missed in smaller reserves, on private land, on mixed-use land, where a lot of species persist, but are unable to be viewed because we are not really marketing them. We're not really pushing those experiences. So taking that as an example, we can really think about trying to market ecotourism and wildlife tourism a little bit different in the country and not just focus on the big and hairies, but say, look, there's a breadth of species that are really important to a lot of people that want to see them. And there's a lot of opportunity that we can dive into there to make sure that we start to utilize that across the board.
Do you think there is a correlation between the types of viewings that are done at reserves and farms that might help the situation when it comes to how people feel about the sightings? Because we're used to doing game drives in game drive vehicles, but I think a lot of these reserves are now also doing eco trails where you're actually walking between the wildlife.
Yes, definitely. So when we were conducting the study, you're quite limited with the monitors at the moment because you do want to avoid things like changes in humidity and heat because that can affect your sweat, obviously, and if your sweat's affected, you can mess with the signal. So we were confined really to those game viewing vehicles for the predominant throughout the study. And the issue with that is that you're confined to one form of tourism, one form of viewing, as you point out, which is the traditional way of going about things. And what we did find is that when you are confined to vehicles like that, anybody who's been to a Big Five game reserve recently or in the last while will tell you that I'm sure one of their pet peeves are overcrowding at sightings. And when there's overcrowding at a sighting, we know that this can stress out a lot of animals, depending on the species and whether or not that animal is habituated or not. But what we actually found during the study as well was that if you had an overcrowded sighting, you had a dampened emotional response to that sighting. So we had a couple of cheetah sightings where we actually got our highest readings at some of those sightings and our lowest readings at some of those sightings as well. So what that's telling us is that there is excitement for that animal, but in a lot of our respondents, they get frustrated at those sightings. So by diversifying the kind of activities you run, you can mitigate that overcrowding, you can provide new experiences to your guest. And when we are doing something like a game drive, we're really relying on one stimulus. So as you mentioned, something like walking trails, what that is going to do is engage people a lot more, engage a lot more of their senses and also introduce them to a lot more novel species. So if you have a walking trail where you are specifically going birding or looking at insects or focusing on certain plant species, that also introduces that novelty aspect, which we would then hypothesize will have that same or similar spiking effect in your electrodermal activity to just viewing the big five over and over again.
So I think something like overcrowding will mostly happen in our national parks. We see that on the news, especially over the festive times when people go to the Kruger and that kind of thing. But if we had to draw a comparison between smaller private farms where people can go and do their own viewing, I mean, we were out not too long ago and we saw a leopard sighting in the evening and it was just us. I mean, that doesn't compare to those overcrowded sightings you see in the Kruger where it's 50 people looking at the same leopard.
No, for sure. And when you examine this and look a bit more closely, so this is part of a bigger study that we've been doing, looking at tourism as more of a whole within Southern Africa. And we find that when you also survey people and you ask them what's important to them, things like closeness are important and proximity are important, but also the quality of the sighting matters in terms of whether or not they're disturbed by other people, whether or not the animal is disturbed. And these are factors that I think we need to take a lot more seriously, because when people talk about sighting quality, I think we often conflate that with just being close to an animal. And what we're starting to find, especially with these data that we've pulled now, is that proximity isn't the be-all and end-all. And if you have certain vehicles that are crowding a sighting, vehicle placement at a sighting is also really important, because there is a big opportunity for those private landowners or smaller reserves to be able to offer those experiences where you can be, like you say, one-on-one, if possible. But when you are in a big reserve, there's definitely opportunities for managing those sightings a little bit better to make sure that one vehicle doesn't block view. For most people, what we find from our survey data, which is accompanying this, is that being able to view the animal clearly, make sure the animal isn't disturbed, and for them themselves not to be disturbed, is a big determinant of whether or not they view that as a quality sighting. So the quality is definitely context dependent, and it's not all about just crowding the animal and getting close.
Well, we've got about 30 seconds left, Bruce. Can you maybe give our viewers, especially the guys who are owners of game farms and do a lot of game drives and that kind of thing, what would your best advice be for people coming in, especially tourists who want to see some nice sightings?
I think it's all about diversifying your experience as much as you can. We're seeing that it's about, yes, it is about the big five, it's about the big and hairies, but, you know, understanding your guests, if you are doing game drives, and making sure that you understand you can offer far more than just the traditional tourism marketed opportunities is going to be something that really pushes your guest experience to the next level.
Fantastic. Bruce, thank you so much for your time this morning. This Bruce Crossey, 'n wildlewe-endokrinoloog by die Universiteit van Pretoria. Ons hoop jy het 'n lekker naweek en ons sien mekaar weer maandag.